From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Thanks for tuning in. Featured today, K-State's Cassie Jones. She'll provide an update on the African Swine Fever situation in the Dominican Republic, which has galvanized the attention of the U.S. pork industry. She reminds about the magnitude of this threat to hog production, and Cassie reports on what actions are in motion now to keep this disease from entering this country. She also discusses the management role of you individual hog producers in practicing extra biosecurity as part of the overall effort to shield the industry from ASF. Today's agricultural news headlines are ahead, as is K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven with his weekly Stop, Look, and Listen. That's our lineup on this Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network, and you're tuned into Agriculture Today. Welcome once more. It's been back in the headlines in recent weeks, and it has the full attention, of course, of the swine industry here in the United States, and that is the confirmation of African swine fever in an island nation not that far from this country, the Dominican Republic. Well, Kansas State University scientists have been deeply involved in various aspects of ASF research, and among those is our guest now. She's a feed scientist in K-State's Animal Sciences and Industry Department, Cassie Jones. Cassie, thanks for coming over once again. Let's set the table here because folks need to fully understand the nature of African swine fever. What is it?
Well, thanks for having me, Eric. African swine fever virus is, as the name implies, originated from Africa, and it's only going to affect pigs. And so it is not a zoonotic disease, and so it's only one that affects pigs and other pig-related species like wild boar and feral pigs. And pork from the affected animals is safe for human consumption. So certainly it's a huge, major concern, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but it is only a concern within the swine industry. But again, it's a virus that affects pigs and causes them to have very extreme fevers. It is a foreign animal disease to the United States, and we are hoping to keep it that way. The big problem with ASF is that it's highly infectious and has a very high case fatality rate, meaning that almost every pig who's going to contract the disease will die eventually. And so once a farm has a single animal affected, the most humane management option at that point is to unfortunately euthanize the entire affected herd.
And we can't adequately describe the costliness of this in so many ways to a farm so afflicted with ASF.
Exactly. This is an economically devastating disease. It's also a disease that's devastating to the mental health of producers and to obviously the welfare of animals that are on the farm. And so as people who care for animals on a daily basis, this is one that's extremely devastating. But also from an economic aspect, it's quite concerning to us in the United States because it would have major implications on United States trade. And so it is a reportable disease, meaning that we have a mandatory reporting obligation to the World Health Organization, and that can very quickly will shut down meat imports and at least specifically pork imports from the United States into many of our primary trade countries.
Again, it is now found, and it's been affirmed in the Dominican Republic. How it got there, what is known to this moment?
Yeah, that's one of the more concerning aspects of the disease is that we know and have been watching ASF spread slowly from Africa through Eurasia into Eastern Europe over the last decade as it kind of migrates with the feral pig population and wild boar population. But then it jumped to Southeast Asia. And we've seen some of these jumps previously in history, and including in the 70s when it was originally introduced into the Dominican Dominican Republic and into Cuba. And we believe that in this case, it likewise, from what occurred back then, is that the most likely case is that it came through passenger luggage, where we have a country and an island nation in terms of the Dominican Republic, where about half of the sows are in intensive production, similar to that of the United States. The other half would be largely backyard swine farms where there's routine practices of garbage feeding, perhaps not routine cooking of that garbage beforehand. And so we believe that this was first brought to the country by passenger luggage, passengers importing, illegally smuggling pork from an affected ASF country, maybe a sausage that they brought home and then decided to feed the scraps to their pig. And unfortunately, that then caused an entire island nation to break with the devastating disease.
And it's clear the biosecurity levels in the Dominican are all over the map.
That's correct. And we have some farms that we're aware of that are part of an intensive production system that have relatively strong biosecurity compared to what we would see in the United States in our standards that have been affected. Unfortunately, ASF loves to survive. It is known for its survival in both pork, but also on different fomites, things that can transport viruses like vehicles and people's footwear. And so that's one of the concerning aspects, is that we want to make sure that we identify the disease as quickly as possible so that we can stop the spread of it. And unfortunately, that did not occur very rapidly within the Dominican Republic.
So to round out the status on ASF in that country, where does it stand? What's happening there?
Yeah, in early July, we actually started to see some farmers reporting what they thought was initially pneumonia. They had pigs that they had some mortality, they had coughing, red splotches, which in retrospect should have been maybe a bit more of a signal, but some red splotching on the skin and purple tips to the ears and to the back legs, again, indicating that fever, a part of African swine fever virus. And so initially they were calling in veterinarians believing that this may be pneumonia. They did send some samples as part of a cooperative agreement that we have with the Dominican Republic to Plum Island, which within just a few years, those samples would have come to Manhattan, Kansas, here to NBAF, to our new National Bioagro-Defense Facility. But at the current time, they're still being sent to Plum, and so they were sent to Plum Island, and there were 2 pigs from 2 different provinces in that initial round that were confirmed with African swine fever virus. Once they recognized that and the country realized that they were positive for the disease, the USDA started to assist with some pretty intensive surveillance, as you can imagine. And where we stand today is that we do have affected farms in 11 of the 32 provinces of the Dominican Republic. And again, that's one of the most concerning parts of this whole story, is how did it get there, but then how did it spread so quickly without being detected when we're all supposed to be on our guard and looking for clinical signs? Because once it spreads to those affected farms, unfortunately, we have to stamp all those animals out.
And that means euthanasia.
Unfortunately, it's the best option for both the disease and disease management and also for the animal welfare. Like I said, those animals are going to die a non-friendly death. And so the most humane thing we can do is to euthanize the entire affected farm, as well as any farms within the immediate geographic area. That likewise will be the policy within the United States if we ever were to contract the disease. And so we're seeing that currently in the Dominican Republic. And so our current hope within the United States is that while it was close to home, that we have ramped up some additional biosecurity and hoping to use this as a reminder so that we can continue to prevent ASF from coming onto our soil.
And we want to talk about those steps that are being implemented now. Do want to insert here, though, that you have, as a researcher, been looking at African swine fever and how it might spread through feed channels, and that's an important cog of this, Cassie.
Yeah, one of the things that, as you can think about what's happening in the Dominican Republic right now, is we have, like I said, about half the country's pigs are in backyard systems, half the country's pigs are in intensive swine production systems, and so you're talking about 35,000 sows and their respective offspring in different management systems that we have to feed. And we still need to continue to manage those animals, and the ones that are healthy become that much more important to our ability to feed the country. And so how do we feed pigs that are on an affected farm and then return maybe something like a feed truck to a non-affected feed mill and then feed other farms in a safe manner. We know that feed and ingredients and the people that deliver that material and the vehicles that deliver that material to and from a farm can be excellent fomites for a disease, because we've done an excellent job with biosecurity to prevent farm-to-farm transmission and recognize that we can prevent farm-to-farm transmission by showering and very high biosecurity requirements like changing clothes and changing shoes and having downtime. But sometimes that's just not practical when it comes into the feed industry, when pigs need to be fed and feed needs to be delivered.
And you discovered this just as a footnote here. Upon traveling to China during its ASF outbreak, which probably is still a factor there, and making these observations firsthand.
That's right. We've been to both China and a lot of our research is actually focused in Vietnam on studying the epidemiology of how farms are breaking or not breaking based on different biosecurity measures that they've implemented and the success of different measures, really the practicality. A lot of our research that we work on in the feed safety team, which would be Dr. Jason Woodworth, Dr. Jordan Gebhardt, and Dr. Chad Polk and myself, as well as, to be honest, the grad students who do almost all of the work. We really focus on how can we understand disease migration and disease management out in the field, but then we need to be able to provide some solutions. And so we typically learn pretty important lessons from how countries like Vietnam, like China are managing the disease, and then bring those back into the United States, those lessons, and can do some controlled research studies at our Biosecurity Research Institute, at our Cargill Feed Safety Research Center, hopefully eventually at NBAF, so that we can better understand through both controlled research and these epidemiological studies how to have more solutions and better solutions that are more practical for our pork producers if this ever were to occur within the U.S.
Cassie, we need to take a quick break. We'd like to return and talk about implementing on-farm protocols as part of the defense against ASF. Cassie Jones is with us, feed scientist here at Kansas State University. We'll return with her after this break. This is Agriculture Today. Agriculture Today continues now as we're examining the situation with African swine fever in a country not all that far offshore from the United States, the Dominican Republic, and the considerable efforts underway now in this country to prevent it from taking root and spreading into the U.S. swine industry, which would be devastating, to say the least. Our guest is Cassie Jones. Cassie is a feed scientist at Kansas State University in the Animal Sciences and Industry Department. So you laid out where we are with the ASF concern in the Dominican, Cassie. What's happening here in the U.S.? Is the industry implementing extra heightened protocols now to be on alert and keep that disease from catching on here?
Yes and no. So in many cases, we have already been on high alert for African swine fever virus introduction into the United States because so many of our major trade partners are now ASF positive and have been since really 2016, and that continues to grow every year. That said, this is the first time in 30 years that it's been within our continent. And so certainly there are some unique things that have been implemented relatively recently to make sure that we're really just ramping up and being very stringent on our biosecurity. When we look at the Dominican Republic itself, we already had controls in place on behalf of USDA to prevent pork and pigs from coming in to the United States from the Dominican Republic because they had been positive and have been positive for classical swine fever virus. And so we already had policies in place where pigs, pork, and pork-containing products were not being allowed to come into the United States from the Dominican Republic. That said, we know now there's a greater risk of, if smuggling were to occur, that smuggling contain infectious virus. And so we now have greater surveillance activity of passenger air traffic coming in from Dominican Republic flights. The Beagle Brigade that maybe you've heard about in different airports, where these beagles are highly trained to sniff out pork products because everybody always wants to bring a sausage or a specialized pork product from a country and bring it back as a gift. These are dogs that are specially trained to smell out pork-containing products, and so they're being used much more heavily on flights that are coming in from the Dominican Republic. And then we have increased surveillance within areas that are U.S. territories like Puerto Rico. One of our concerns is that when we look at the initial outbreak with African swine fever virus back in the late 70s, it was originally introduced into Cuba, and then from Cuba it moved to the Dominican Republic, and then to Haiti, and then to Brazil, all because of both boat and air traffic and just the way that we move pigs and pork products throughout those island nations. And so we need to keep some of those lessons in mind from history so that we continue to ramp up and prevent that from entering or allowing ASF to enter into the United States.
Bringing it then down to the farm level and what individual producers can or should be doing. Again, it's not here, but what sorts of actions should swine producers be taking up?
You're right, Eric. It's not here. That said, it's going to take all of us collectively to make sure that it continues to not be here and not affect our domestic herd. The fortunate thing about controlling for ASF is that it's also going to control and prevent the introduction of a lot of our domestic diseases like PRRS and PEDV. And so anything that are circulating diseases within the United States, those same actions are going to have immediate payoff for producers that are implementing that biosecurity in terms of minimizing foreign animal disease entry, but also domestic disease entry. Basic practices would be things like making sure that we know the clinical signs of disease. So be looking at those animals every day. When it comes to ASF, recognizing that there is not necessarily a telltale sign. It's not like you walk into a barn and you have mass mortalities on day one. That many times this disease gets confused or misdiagnosed as a different disease, like in the case of the Dominican Republic, where they thought it was initially pneumonia. And so keeping an eye out for pigs that look quite feverish, especially if there's some spotting on skin, red splotches, purple ears. Again, it's difficult sometimes to distinguish that from a PRRS outbreak. And so recognizing and keeping in mind that when we're sampling and looking at diagnoses, that we have an open mind to ASF as well. Other things that we can do on a day-to-day basis on pig farms themselves, routine practices like making sure we're showering in and showering out from those farms, that at the bare minimum, we're changing clothes, changing footwear. If we are still allowing visitors, that we're not allowing visitors that have traveled outside of the United States, or certainly not to any ASF positive countries for a period of time without significant downtime. We typically don't allow pork-containing products in the lunches of workers that come in and work on those farms, and ensuring that we don't have swill feeding. You know, we just wrapped up county fair here with my own son just a couple of weeks ago, and it can be awfully tempting to take these scraps down to the show pigs to help clean up after the fair's over and let them gnaw on some of those scraps that they think would be delicious. It's really important that we do not feed pork-related products, and some of that garbage to pigs within our own U.S. herd.
And on the feed subject, and the conventional feedstuffs now, of course, something you're very close to because you've researched this so intently. What protocols would be appropriate there?
Actually, we're working right now with a group of producers on a project that's funded by a combination of National Pork Board and National Pork Producers Council, understanding some policy decisions of what we should be doing as best practices, either from a voluntary basis or if we should be really looking at some regulatory practices as it relates to broadly the entire feed industry and the entire pork industry. Collectively, what that group has decided to recommend for our best practices is that we do not import raw grains or oil seeds for use in pork products from ASF endemic regions. And so when we think about organic soybeans or organic soybean meal, whole corn, whole wheat, many times we're just from a price perspective, not going to be importing those into the United States. But from time to time in specific niche markets, there can be some economic incentives to bring those in and feed into pigs or to use them in feed mills that are feeding pigs. And so we're looking and working within industry to commit to not feeding those high-risk ingredients from ASF endemic countries. Likewise, we have a number of producers who have completely phased out the feeding of pork-containing products such as plasma, porcine meat and bone meal, and other porcine-based ingredients that historically have been a great value and source of nutrition. Some producers are still feeding them and are doing so under strict biosecurity and with quite a bit of surveillance and care. Others have just chosen to completely withdraw those from their formulations.
As far as feed transportation from farm to farm, again, very close to the work you've done. Anything there at this point that should be implemented?
No, it's absolutely something that we need to be implementing currently with our own domestic diseases. And then we also need to be having those conversations as it comes to foreign animal diseases. And so right now we have feed mills that we know are feeding PRRS positive populations and PRRS negative populations. And so as you have a feed truck delivering and a feed truck driver delivering feed from an affected farm to a negative farm, what steps are being taken? Are we washing the exterior of that truck? Are we requiring it to be sanitized and dried before we're bringing it back into the feed mill? Because our research has really demonstrated that once you introduce a virus into a feed mill or feed manufacturing facility, it goes everywhere and it stays there for a long time. And so really putting some thought into what order we are feeding farms and staggering those and staging them appropriately, understanding and thinking about, yes, we require people to shower in and shower out of farms. Should we be doing something similar to vehicles as well? And then are there some feed additives that we could be adding to further reduce the risk of some of these pathogens if they happen to still be present within the feed or ingredients?
Well, lastly, you've been very close to this AFS situation through your research for several years now. Your perspective here, is the U.S. swine industry adequately prepared, adequately shielded in the advent of ASF making a move?
Boy, I think it's not the $1 million question, that's the $1 billion question, right?
Quite literally. Yeah.
Quite literally. I'd say we've been successful thus far. And that's quite promising because we have been continuing to trade grains, oil seeds, bringing in products into farms safely from ASF endemic regions for the past decade. And so that our history speaks that our actions are working. What does worry me is I'd say something somewhat similar for the Dominican Republic, is that we believed collectively we had, both between North and South America, relatively strong biosecurity protocols in place. And so I'm hoping that this serves, if anything, as a wake-up call to us so that we continue to have constant vigilance and constantly monitor our situation and continue to make progress on improving biosecurity into and out of our farms.
It's all hands on deck. Producers should obviously maintain a dialogue with their herd health practitioners on these matters, and biosecurity is the watchword, of course, through all of this. Cassie, hats off to you and others involved in research into this area for keeping the vigilance up. Thank you for going over this with us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks, Eric.
Feed scientist, K-State's Animal Sciences and Industry Department, Cassie Jones. We'll be back with more for you on this Agriculture Today. Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. And next up, today's agricultural news headlines, these courtesy in part of DTN. With yesterday's passage of that $1.2 trillion infrastructure package in the Senate, various agricultural interests had their specific provision or issue that they were excited to see finally addressed. The Senate passed the bill 69-30 to send it on to the House, which will likely take up the Senate bill when Congress returns from its August recess. Now, for livestock producers, the infrastructure bill includes the haulers of agriculture and livestock Livestock Safety, or HALS, Act. That provision would allow livestock haulers to bypass normal trucking hours of service limitations if the livestock haulers are within 150 miles of their destination. According to the president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Kansas cattle feeder Jerry Bone, what the HALS Act does is it allows transport of livestock across the country in a humane way. As he noted, if a trucker can get that extra 150 miles without having to shut down, that's going to help haul cattle in a more humane way. The bill includes a projected $550 billion in new spending for infrastructure over 10 years, including $110 billion for roads and $40 billion for bridge projects. Another $55 billion would go to various water projects, $66 billion going to rail projects. Bone noted that the bill also includes $65 billion to expand the broadband access nationally. That's expected to build broadband infrastructure in rural America. Also, the National Corn Growers Association weighed in, spotlighting the $17.3 billion in the bill for ports and inland waterways. The corn growers noting 60% of corn exports utilize the inland waterways and ports. The Association of Equipment Manufacturers had recently released a study showing that the legislation could create more than 100,000 equipment manufacturing jobs and nearly 500,000 U.S. manufacturing jobs overall, according to Kip Eideberg, the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Relations for that organization. And the President of the American Farm Bureau Federation, Zippy Duvall, said that the bill deals with pressing infrastructure issues facing the country that he says have become too big to ignore, adding that improvements in transportation infrastructure, as well as repair and upgrades to the Western water infrastructure, will ensure that farmers will continue to keep this nation fed, as he put it. He also pointed to the tax concerns facing farmers and thanked the senators for preserving important tax provisions that make it possible for farmers to pass the family business to the next generation. Duvall urged the House to follow the Senate's lead by leaving tax rates and a stepped-up basis unchanged. Not everyone issued glowing statements of praise for the bill. The CEO of the American Coalition of Ethanol, Brian Jennings, said the bill is a missed opportunity to help deliver lower carbon emissions in the transportation sector through higher ethanol blends. Jennings noted at least some senators had sought to add language to the bill that would provide those higher blends, such as E15 year-round. The bill has dozens of provisions that set aside specific funds for rural projects in areas such as roads, bridges, waterways, and broadband. Certain rural areas will see federal government matches or community projects to as much as 90%. Well, midday tomorrow, we'll have a much better idea of the size of this year's major row crops and what kind of demand there will be for those crops by way of the USDA numbers. Here's more on that from the USDA's Gary Crawford.
This week, USDA issues its first survey-based yield and production forecasts for the major row crops, and naturally,
there's a lot of interest in the market right now in terms of what those yields will be.
Also highly interested will be Mark Jekanowski, chairman of USDA's World Outlook Board, because that group of analysts will have the job of taking the yield and production forecasts and making new forecasts for what will happen to that production, including domestic use, ending stocks, average prices, exports. Tricky proposition this early in the season.
It is a little bit tricky.
But he says they've got lots of things to watch for clues, such as the current pace of U.S. ag exports and, for example, what's happening with
the second crop corn in Brazil.
Drought and frost both bringing on concerns about that crop, which competes directly with U.S. corn, and so
the size and the quality of that crop is something we're watching pretty closely.
That crop 58% in the bin now. Normally it would be 70%. USDA's new round of forecasts comes out very soon now, Thursday noon Eastern Time. Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And, of course, we'll be talking about those numbers, what they mean to the grain markets, with K-State's Dan O'Brien during his regular weekly market segment on Friday right here. Central Kansas Ranch will be hosting the second Kansas Livestock Association Kansas State University Ranch Management Field Day in the 2021 series. Scarlett Higgins says the program will feature topics on rotational grazing, vaccination programs for the cow herd, and industry issues being discussed on Capitol Hill.
The Roth family, which consists of Norman Roth, his wife Cindy, and their 2 children, Cammie and Colton, utilize rotational grazing to help maintain their commercial cow herd throughout the year. During the August 19th Ranch Management Field Day near Sterling, they will highlight how their system works and provide a tour. In addition, David Kraft, retired Natural Resources Conservation Service State Rangeland Management Specialist, will talk through the benefits and challenges of implementing a rotational grazing program and how it can be used across a variety of environments. K-State Extension veterinarian A.J. Tarpoff will be on hand to discuss the importance of a proper vaccination program to the success of a cow herd and will provide different options that can be adjusted to fit the needs of any operation. To round out the program, National Cattlemen's Beef Association President Jerry Bone will give an update on industry issues being discussed in Washington, D.C., including cattle marketing and tax policy. The KLA K-State Field Day will begin with registration at 3 p.m. and include a free beef dinner at 6:30 p.m. All livestock producers and others in the business are invited to attend. For more information and directions, go to KLA.org and click on Events and Meetings. Additional field days will be held August 17th at Deseret Ranch's Coon Ranch near Satana and August 24th at Gun Barrel Ranch southwest of Eskridge. All the field days are sponsored by the Farm Credit Associations of Kansas. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And you can find out more as well about those field days at ksubeef.org. Those are coming up starting next week. And Canadian Pacific has upped its offer for Kansas City Southern to approximately $31 billion. That potentially reignites the bidding war with rival railroad Canadian National. Kansas City Southern, the smallest of the remaining major U.S. railroads, but it controls critical cross-border routes with Mexico. That's a glance at today's agricultural news headlines. We'll be back with K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven and another Stop, Look, and Listen. This is Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
The homestead where she had grown up was sold.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
I wonder if you are a Swede, an old Swede, how many of Selma Lagerlöf books are standing on your bookshelf? She lived November 1858 until March 1940. It was in August 2007 that Anneke, my wife, and I visited her Marbeck farm, situated in the beautiful valley of Värmland, Sweden. I remember walking slowly through the restored farmhouse and the surrounding garden with roses and understanding what it must have meant for her to be able to buy the old farmstand back that she loved so deeply. She was able to do that after she became a very successful writer. She first bought the old homestead with immediate surroundings of the old farm. Later, with more earnings of her writing, she bought more land to complete the holding to what it is now. Marbacka Farm is the word which was for Selma Lagerlöf in the beginning. The homestead where she had grown up was sold. Before strangers took it over, she went to have one last look at her childhood home. And the evening before she went away, perhaps never again to see her cherished spot, she decided in all humility to write for herself, to save for herself what could still be saved of the old home. The happy contentment of her carefree days and the lovely countryside with the long, narrow lake and the blue hills. Selma Lagerlöf wrote many books. In 1906, 1907, she wrote The Wonderful Adventures of Niels. It is translated in many languages. I have an authorized translation in Dutch. Niels Holgersson's Wonderbare Reis, printed in 1917. It's a third print bound in cloth, and I treasure it. I've carefully re-glued the old linen where it let loose. In it, I've glued 3 photos made of the historic homestead and its fields. Selma Lagerlof was a good farmer. She believed in oats for livestock, her horses, and people. I looked at the fields in front of me, which for Sweden were large and flat, good farm country. That same summer, I walked by a second-hand bookstore in Amsterdam and saw the book I bought of Niels' Great Adventure. It's a classic, and I am rereading it. What strikes me is how she is able to share and describe the Swedish landscape as seen from Niels' vantage point, sitting on the goose. Of course, Niels is transformed into a small, very small person. It's a child's story, and yet it is not. Among the many adaptations and translations today, you see it with the white goose on the cover flapping its wings, Niels sitting in the front of the wings with the landscape of forests, lakes and towns and churches and castles below. The thought which comes to me was, who would be able to sit down and describe the Kansas landscape from Kansas City or any other eastern Kansas town going west to the Colorado border? Going east to west, the landscape changes dramatically, passing interesting places. Oh, we have no castles except perhaps just northwest of Lynchburg, the Coronado Heights. Actually, it's amazing if you draw a line more or less straight south of I-70 how many interesting landmarks one would see as a small dwarf sitting on a goose flying west. The trouble is, our geese tend to fly north or south, depending on the time of the year, and so do the Swedish geese, as did the goose who had joined the wild geese flying north to Lapland. And the trick for Niels was to make sure that the goose he rode would safely make this long flight. And then when safely returned, he, Niels, could or would become a normal human being again. Whatever that is, if nothing else, a better human. And that is the core of the story. But just thinking of flying across Kansas from east to west, see what you can come up with. To help you, take a map and roughly draw that straight line west. I know I would have little difficulty making an interesting story. Those of you who fly small airplanes will know and understand what it is like on a clear day with a gentle breeze and sun when shadows are clear. Okay, just come with me while I climb on my goose. Here we go with lots of quacking all around us. We take off of Hillsdale Lake. We pass Ottawa University. The first students walking campus are looking up at the V of geese flying over. We look down at Pomona Lake. We can see the old ruts of the Santa Fe Trail. There's Council Grove. We pass the Tallgrass Prairie National Reserve south of us. We cross Route 77. Below us lays Lost Springs. And onwards we go to Maxwell Game Preserve. Maybe we should rest there and graze on some short grass. Take a look at the buffalo. After a while, back in the air over Bethany College, past Marquette. Lots of other birds at Cheyenne Bottoms Wildlife Area. On we fly into the setting sun. The landscape changes to wide open plains, the wheat fields. And there's corn. North of us, the Pueblo ruins and the church of Marienthal. We settle down near White Woman's Creek and wonder, who was she? It was a long day, but a beautiful flight. Bird's eye view of Kansas.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That'll do it for our Wednesday edition. Thanks for listening in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. over the K-State Radio Network.